we'll start anyway. His fourth archetype in Christians is the sacred clown. That's half of the archetype. And that leads us into another category that it's worth talking about. Sacred clown does bridge, the prophet, the outsider, the one who scouts the consciousness. The role of the clown or the harlequin or the jester in history, has been one who is sometimes humorously on the side, the drag queens who are there to, kind of be the both comic and, deadly serious at the same time, about, reality. My Zen teacher, Roshi Bernie Glassman, often uses the clown nose and has done clown work. There's a Jesuit I know who also has done clown work. It's someone who is allowed, because they're purposely standing apart from the regular flow of society and events, who can speak the truth. But there's something fun about it, right? There's something scary, but it can also be very much fun. The clown the jester is supposed to be funny, but in a way that actually brings you serious, to a serious truth. So this part of the energy and the joy of being the clown is the other half of the archetype, which is not just the social critic, but a gay, young spirit. Now you know how much gay people, especially gay men, are obsessed with youth and appearance and all that. But take it as part of what Carl Jung calls the Peter Pan mentality, which can be negative, as any Jungian will tell you. Someone who refuses to grow up in that mythic sense, not take on responsibility. But it does have a positive archetypal meaning, which is staying youthful. There are even psychologists who say that a mark of maturity is to have the wisdom of age and the spirit of youth constantly through your whole life, no matter what age you are chronologically. And in the famous 2nd century Catholic Christian document, The Shepherd of Hermas, the church is presented as someone who's at the same time a very old woman and a very young woman, who's continually being renewed and yet having the great wisdom of the ages at the same time. So in that sense, it's a great idea, to have as young as you can a great wisdom, but also as old as you may be, an eternally youthful spirit, and the joy of that. And that's one of the things I pointed out 20 years ago too. The very word "gay" absolutely should be a good description of gay people. That they're gay, colorful, gay, joyous. A real shot in the arm for life. There's a certain joyousness in life, which seems to be actually a trait of gay people. Maybe it's partly a reaction to the suffering, but not only. I don't think that's true. I think that's not the full truth of it, but it is actually something that's just an energy in life, a joyful spirit. He quotes a long passage here from the writer James Brown. Gaiety, in the sense, the old sense of being gay, is a great moral good and a high spiritual value, as well as being a key to the universe. Eternal creativity, youthful joy, energy, the divine dance, as many mystics have said in many traditions. God was certainly merry, M-E-R-R-Y, when he played around making giraffes and volcanoes and octopi and comets and toucans. Yeah, Richard Rohr's pointed out that too. What kind of a God would make, a bird of paradise or a platypus? Certainly not the Puritan God who's up there, grouchily looking at everybody's moral behavior. Why would he make a platypus? So there's something joyful about it. The cosmos is full of great silliness. But it goes along with itself. It loves its games. It enjoys its mutations and upheavals. If it didn't like what was going on, it would fall apart. In human relationships, the lack of love is destroying God's beautifully wacky world. Man's vandalism of the earth is similar to the way he treats fellow creatures, bilking, raping, destroying, using living beings as objects of greed and exploitation, as opposed to what we were just practicing. Let things be as they are and speak to you. Love and joy will result. People as well. So much of human society is resentfully loveless. No wonder it's so violent and guilt-ridden. All power seekers want to make slaves of other people, which they create abusive relationships. Lovingness is the essence of gaiety. Gaiety makes us gods. Or put it differently, gaiety is godlike and unites us with God. Gaiety in the sense of that joy and creativity. It's spiritual and unites us with God, he says. Nothing works well without love, and anything done without love is irrelevant or drab. So there's obviously a love being expressed here for creation, for the universe, ultimately for God and for ourselves. Even Nietzsche called the practice of lovingness the gay science. That's a good quote. Right? Rumi said love is the first thing God created. Another quote from him: "We are the Peter Pans of the world, irrepressible ones who believe in magic, folly, and romance." Yes, magic. Things are magic. And in a sense, we never do grow old. That's part of what being gay signifies. Innocence of spirit, perennial youthfulness of soul. The gay spirit is a young spirit, which is why the world leaves us. So, we refuse to become dowdy and old. We refuse to dwindle into the doldrums. We never die. That's a good quote. And then, of course, that leads to something that's very well known. The archetype of keepers of beauty. All the, the artists, and, of all types in the world. Reaching for the sacred. Very important. Is where the sacred comes in. We're going to speak more about that. When you're pursuing beauty in the arts or anywhere, you're already in sacred realm. Everything is sacred, really, as any mystic will tell you. Certainly any Buddhist will tell you. That everything is sacred. There's no difference. It's one of the things Richard Rohr insists on. There's no difference between sacred and profane. Heaven and earth, between holy and unholy. It's everything in itself, as we discover when we let it speak, is sacred and is beautiful to the extent that it is at all. So, keepers of beauty reaching for the sacred. He tells a wonderful story here precisely about he was at a zoo and he saw some birds. The ibis, and seemed like two very strange things. And they had a beautiful nest. The nest was absolutely stunning, about twice the size of the others, and much more beautiful. It was a perfect nest. Went to my professor who was there, told him what was going on. He rather nonchalantly said, "Oh, sure, it's very likely they're both male." Homosexuality is common among certain species of birds. Of course, I thought to myself, leave it to the gay birds to have a fabulous designer nest. So that kind of beauty, it's almost a cliche, interior designer, hairdresser, artist, theater person, etc. It can be very humorous too. I'm going to leave this for you to look at. It's a book that's already 20 years old, but it's still funny, even though some of the topical references are a little outdated. But it's called A World Without Homosexuals. And, it's a comic book. It's a comic book. It has some wonderful things in here. You have an opera house, which is basically empty, except for people doing rap on stage. And there's another one where people are waiting desperately in a restaurant. And they said, the one waiter in town has to go to 2 other places in the deli before he gets to us. So that brings us to another aspect of service industries, which we'll come to in a second. But obviously there's no more theater. All theater, all Broadway closes. Not just for the actors, but because of the actors, because of stage people, etc. So it really would be disastrous if there were no more homosexuals. Who knew the garden? All this stuff. So this is the keepers of beauty. And don't forget, beauty is sacred. Beauty is one of the transcendentals according to St. Thomas Aquinas. Just like being, and the good, and the true. Beauty is part of it, is the name of being. St. Augustine was great on this point too. It's Ivanovich. To perceive beauty in the universe. And maybe, I suspect, because of this gay, youthful spirit, gay people have a special talent. Not exclusively, of course, but often they have a talent for beauty, for seeing beauty and creating beauty, which is a spiritual activity. Both the seeing of it and making beauty. That's why you can find God through art. It doesn't have to just be by going to church or any religion. It could be, through art. Obviously through human relationships. Through any activity which is undertaken in a sacred way, which is attentive and therefore joyful and loving. Gay in that sense. That's part of the key to spirituality, the key to reality. The keepers of beauty, reaching for the sacred as such. And then, as we just said a moment ago, referring to waiters, etc., but also teachers, priests, so many healing professions, have a lot of gay people in them, or ministry to service of others, flag stewards, caregivers taking care of each other. There's nothing more spiritual than that, of course, as Jesus said. Love one another, love your neighbors as yourself. Love others as I have loved you. It's part of a spiritual vision in which, when you really let people, when you are truly present, then you realize your unity with them, your intimacy with them, your lack of separation from non-duality. And therefore, you can, as Jesus himself said, you see Christ seeing Christ. Whatever you do to the least of these, you do to me. It's that kind of intimacy, the kind of spiritual vision, which allows you to see. Maybe it's also because gay people are so often wounded, and that they care not only for each other but for whoever is wounded. You mentioned that a moment ago. Those are on the outside, those who may be excluded, with special sensitivity, having been there themselves, can minister to them. That's maybe a special talent that gay people have through the openness of the womb, the openness of the heart, which is always a wounded heart. Where we get that? Jesus, the sacred heart wounded. A symbol of what all people should have and should be. This openness, this vulnerability of the heart, which then goes out in love to others. And that's the very next one. Mediators, the in-between people, shamans and priests. The priests, sacred functionaries, as I said, just mentioned priests a moment ago. It's a good time to talk about the wound here, because Andrew Harvey goes into it a lot, and I think it's really important. I attended a talk a year or two ago at this One Spirit seminary I mentioned at the beginning. He's a marvelous speaker, and as I say, he's a great mystic himself. And he was emphasizing, that woundedness I referred to earlier, being on the outside, being rejected so often, gay people often through their lives, whether it's family and or church and or society. There's a terrible wounds. And how do you deal with that? I got obviously psychotherapy and all that, but I've been suggesting, and Andrew suggests also, we've got a deep spiritual experience, connecting to Christ, Shiva, whatever spiritual path you follow, to connect to your own beauty and your own worthiness, but also to the woundedness then of others. That's where we come into the service that we have. It's really important, I think, in the gay movement today especially. I mentioned this before, talking about nonviolence, to touch and reach out to the woundedness of all people and not just our own. That gays don't just see their own woundedness and ask for some kind of vindication or being paid back for their services. Like everybody wants to goes into litigation to get some kind of payback for their suffering. But no, to be able to connect to the suffering of everyone and see that it's through the wound, that through the pain, that we rise to compassion, love, and wisdom, and maturity. And really there is no other way. This is something Richard Rohr emphasizes a lot. The path of spiritual growth, the path of contemplation, the path of reality always passes through darkness, through suffering, through pain, through the wound, through failure, often through rejection. In that sense, another head start to get people on the human path, which is the spiritual path. And then, as Christianity makes very clear, and Buddhism too, especially the Tibetan Buddhism exercise of Tonglen, where you take pain of people into yourself, metabolize it, offer that priestly, shamanic offering of people's pain, and receiving the love and the connectedness which allows that to be healed. It's only through the pain. So it's, as Leonard Cohen said, which Richard Rohr quotes, in his song, there's a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. The light only comes in through the cracks. Things that are imperfect, things that don't fit, things that don't jive with our tidy and neat structures of what's morally good or socially acceptable or nice and pretty or whatever. But reality is not like that. Reality includes everything, especially the pain and the wounds. So those aren't obstacles, really, they're pathways. They're gates. Something that Harvey's emphasizing, and also something that Richard Rohr said points out all the time. I'll come back to that again this afternoon. And this is, in strict Christian terms, this is the passion and the resurrection. It's so ironic that Christianity has often, whether Catholics or evangelicals or whatever, has taken Christ as this kind of like special case, because he's divine and we're not, where he had to offer the special sacrifice because God was mad, and only a big sacrifice, right? Divine sacrifice would placate the angry God. So he suffered for us. Well, good. He's taking care of that. And now, as long as we're good and we do the right thing, then he'll take us into heaven. Look, Christ's path is the human path. That's why it works that way. He didn't say worship me, as Richard points out, only you do that, you do it right. But he said follow me, as if we had any other choice. Follow me. Not only doing what I do or doing what I say, but living as I live and dying as I die. Where you go through the pain and the suffering and the death without recrimination or retaliation, non-violence again. Forgive them, Father, they don't know what they do. Into your hands I commend my spirit. So trusting yourself to a bigger picture, to a bigger reality. And so it's precisely through the pain that we get to the light, or as the ancient, the famous Christian dictum, Catholic dictum says, per crucem ad lucem, through the cross to the light. Per crucem ad lucem. And that's not some special thing God dreamed up for Christ and us Catholics. It's the way the universe works. That's the way things are. In space and time and matter, things are imperfect, and there's going to be clashing and wounding and traumas of all kinds, natural, social, psychological, spiritual, and that should be part of contemplation. Everything belongs. So again, people maybe have a special entree, a special challenge, a special kick to get them started to follow that, because they don't have so many wounds. Who doesn't, but still, this is really kind of a special kind of wound that is always there. Just as Christ's wounds stay remain after the resurrection, so do our wounds. They're always there. They're healed, but they don't disappear, because I can't get in any other way. So the cracks in that sense are always there. So that's and then the in-between, the mediation. Mediation between death and life, mediation between darkness and light, mediation between God and humanity, mediation between male and female. All these dualities, especially between God and ourselves, are overcome. Remember special, that is really especially false. Everything is natural. Or supernatural, whatever you want to call it. Don't call it anything. Just let it speak. You find it all fits together. That's a really important point. The in-between mediators, a priestly function, which we all have, and the final one that he mentions, and that I'm especially focused on this afternoon, which Andrew especially focuses on, and he did in his talk, and then we'll open it up for questions and then do another exercise before we break for lunch, is the divine androgen, which he and other authors, I've seen other authors come up with this too, that this is kind of an evolutionary function. That's the way we're moving, we should be moving. And again, gay people have a head start. Whether you're a gay man or lesbian, that the masculine and feminine energies are already kind of a special integration, combination, peace, existence in you. And we'll see why that's so important, especially this afternoon. But you can already see that the overcoming of those dualities, separations, contradictions, the conflicts that arise between all these different separations. That masculine and feminine one is also one that needs to be overcome, can be overcome, and is part of the special spiritual talent that I think gay people especially have. Carl Jung, has made it, more socially and intellectually, psychologically current and acceptable to speak about the anima, the animus, the masculine pole in a woman, any woman, not just a gay woman, and the feminine pole, the anima, in men, all men. Whereas gay men seem a little more comfortable with that than straight men. To say the least. And we'll talk more about that this afternoon too. But it is important to realize that polarity is there. If you've ever done battle with your anima, or the other pole, as I have, it's really a powerful force. You don't want to monkey with it. You've got to respect it, just like you have to respect the pot. You have to respect your enemy, or you have to respect yourself. You have to respect the environment. And respect other people. You have to respect that pole. Because in all those cases, there are powerful energies present that want to be loved and received and integrated in yourself, others, the world. And part of the function of contemplation is to see that, respect that, further that, be that. And that's the spiritual path. That's a particularly important one. I'll talk more about this afternoon as well. I just want to finish by reading this passage from, this is on the bibliography too, Queer Dharma. What does that mean? Well, there are 2 volumes of this published already more than 10 years ago. Of course, it's from California, where the gay Buddhists. Dharma just means, the way reality, the way things are. It's a Sanskrit term, and, queer, obviously. So, Queer Dharma, Voices of Gay Buddhists, volume 2. And he has this one guy called Mark Marion has a wonderful passage here talking about these dualisms and the social consequences of that. What is it about us that scares people so much? Looking at the question from a spiritual Buddhist rather than a political, social, psychological perspective, seems to come back to non-duality and the suffering that a dualistic worldview engenders. Us and men. Often to be your American problem. Gay identity flies challenges at the dearly held convictions of a dualistic culture. Our androgyny undermines the masculine versus feminine duality. Our open and ecstatic approach to sexuality challenges the body versus soul duality. And our curiosity to explore the edge of conformity, we'll talk about that, challenges the light versus dark, good versus bad duality, which I've just been talking about too. In a culture that clings to a dualistic worldview as what is right and true, gays and lesbians are perceived as abstract. And it reminds me, I do want to speak a little bit more about that body versus soul split. There's been so much in the West. You know, the ecstatic love of being alive, being physical, that people have, and gays especially have, is part of that integration, that talent they have. And even about sexuality. Whatever your view of gay sex, and your marriage, and your sexuality, all of that, it's a very great contribution to have at least a positive, joyous, playful view. A more positive view of the body and sexuality, which I think gay people do have a talent for. Whatever you do with that morally, whatever your moral worldview is, that in itself is a tremendous benefit and a very beautiful thing for our culture, in which the West, and Christianity in the West particularly, has lived in a Platonic worldview or an Augustinian worldview, where the spirit is what's good, and the usually meaning the mind and the soul, and the body is bad. And you know how much you've suffered from that. If you grew up with that in grammar school, that kind of view that was, you absorbed, like in your food, that kind of view. It's very, very destructive. Very, totally non-incarnation, totally non-Christian. Certainly not in touch with the Hebrew part. So to have a basically comfortable, non-Augustinian, in other words, view of the body and sexuality and pleasure, just plain pleasure, whatever, any kind of pleasure, which Augustine found on, is a very healthy thing, psychologically and spiritually. It's one of the splits that Richard Rohr speaks about, this body-soul thing. Eckhart Tolle, too, the idea that the mind is spiritual. As we've been talking about the mind all morning, think the mind is spiritual? Think again, or experience again. The mind is not spiritual at all. It's full of nonsense and garbage. And it's just as far removed from God as the body is. Or, in the contemplative view, just as close to God as the body. And when it's finally open and receptive, just as with the body. In the end, Buddhists would never even make the distinction of body and soul. It's just a construct. It is. Calling yourself a soul in a body, or someone having a soul or a body, is a construct which gets in the way of contemplation. Let it speak to you. Be fearless enough, and humble enough, and open enough to let your being speak to you. All of it. Yes, even the dark, shadowy side. Let it speak to you and discover beauty and joy, just as with let it speak to you, the bodily dimension, which is there, and you'll discover the beauty of it. And what was that? That it is a basically very, very beautiful thing, and is included in our whole being. Does anyone want to? Yeah, because Richard Rohr says the problem is, and this is a really important point. I'm going to leave it to you in bibliography. The problem in the spiritual life is not the shadow self, again, to use Jung, which for many people is being gay. Or any side of ourselves, our sexuality, any aspect of ourselves, not necessarily bad, just there, that we've left undeveloped because we're in denial, we're afraid. And ultimately, at least in the second half of life, you have to face. You have to. You'll just be destroyed. Real destroying. That problem is not the shadow self. It's part of who we are, and it's good in itself. Let it speak to you. The problem, he says, is the separate self. The ego self, that likes to think of itself as in control and independent, where it's just a separate little self that you constructed for yourself, the ego self. wants to be in control of everything, other people, the body, that sort of stuff. And the only way to overcome that is the connectedness of contemplation. Where that separate self disappears, it's an illusion, as the Buddhists rightly say, it's an illusion. So in other words, we've been mortifying the wrong thing for 2,000 years in Christianity. We've been trying to mortify the body so that our spirit can be free. All we've made are monsters of the mind, cruelty, looking after money and power and violence and conquering, popes, Christian countries, quotes Christian countries, or people, individuals. We've completely missed the point of Christianity. Completely. Loving your enemies, non-violence. No, but as long as we don't have an impure thought, as long as we govern our bodies, then we're fine. No, we're schizophrenic. Really important. Okay. Comments, questions on those other points of gay spirituality we're talking about? Make sense? Yeah.
I really like what you're talking about, and it would be interesting exploring a bit more about the incarnation and seeing that as almost ironically like a foil to Augustine. Because Augustine really affects so much of the practices, I think, of the church and the law. And so, again, my driving factor tends to be more mystical. So I love the Eucharist. I love adoration. I think all Catholics should be on their knees at the Eucharist because that's a bodily reaction.
Expressive time.
So I think that's a very interesting thing. I never thought about that we're mortifying the wrong thing rather than the reverse. So I think that's something that I think we could tap into that as gay people and as Roman Catholics and say this is our tradition. That God is, but is not only God, this all-powerful thing that we can't understand, but God is also right there, truly physically like us. So did God have sexual desires? No, but that's...
Augustine would never say that.
What's that?
Augustine would never say that.
Well, Augustine wouldn't, but that's the point.
Yeah, exactly.
So
that's very true.
So I think but I think we can also use that to say and talk about that what we venerate and what we truly believe with the Eucharist is body and spirit, and so all of these things. It's not one kind of or the other. So you're talking about duality. It's to separate that out.
It's one whole. One whole. And that's to me, and not to even use those words and those distinctions because they create divisions within us. And as you said, I don't want to jump on your words. We say God is not only this thing out there. Of course, it's not a thing at all, and it's not up there. God is always right here. Even God in heaven right now is right here. It's just the other side of this dimension. It's not up there. It's like still space and time. So we got to get rid of all this nonsense.
Well, the law is not in heaven, that you should look for it. It's in your heart.
And that's the only place. It's in the heart of everything, which is what you discover when you let reality speak to you. You discover, wow, God is right there. I didn't know it, just like Jacob said when he woke up from sleeping on the bed.
And that's directly out of the scripture. We don't have to go to the Zen or to outside of the canon.
Well, not if you don't want to.
No, you don't want to.
It's nice to have those confirmations.
You can.
Well, I'm going to talk more about that this afternoon. But yes, it is right there, and that's why I keep saying it's right there in our own tradition, but we've been blind to it because we follow these other paths which are more ego-satisfying, and we haven't really challenged ourselves. And in the last 500 years especially, we've so downplayed contemplation, our inner experience, in the name of authority and tradition, partly because of the Protestant Reformation. But it's a tragedy. And as you said very well too, Augustine, as one theologian said, his contribution to the theology of grace is tragic. Augustine is a tremendous complex genius. He's a marvelous mystic. He has fantastic stuff about beauty and all this other stuff. But he's also a mess when it comes to, partly because of the historical theological controversies he got involved with about grace and original sin and all that stuff. But he came up with some horrible stuff about, the body and pleasure and God's predestination and grace and all this stuff that got all twisted out of shape all through history. Really, really is tragic. It's not too strong a word. So we have to take things as they are in all their complexity. Augustine has a lot of cracks. So do the scriptures. Scriptures have a lot of horrible stuff in there because they reflect their times. It's a whole story of salvation, God leading this recalcitrant, messed up creation forward. So we can't expect to be perfect lucidity or perfect clarity on every question, including being gay. This is a good way to approach the passages in the Old Testament, especially. What I'm going to do that seems to talk about gay, that they don't know where you're reading today. But passages that seem to refer to that have to be taken in their cultural context. A lot of cracks, a lot of opacity, obfuscation there, a lot of cultural blindness. Even in Paul. Paul is no less complicated than Augustine is. Yeah. He's a great mystic too about the cosmic Christ, and we're all one, we're all transformed into Christ. But at the same time, he thinks women should have their hair covered in church. I mean, come on. We have to accept the complexity of ourselves and of other people. It's just part of the game, part of the divine dance. Yeah.
But don't you think? One of the things that I find that I have found is, what is it about men who, in the Bible, that once they find Jesus, they were drunks, they were sex crazed, they were, all those things. And if you look at our culture today, so you look at Paul, and you look at Augustine, and you look at somebody like Mel Gibson, and you look at somebody like George Bush. Once they find God, then they feel they have to protect the world from exactly who they were when they were wild, crazy, out of control. And write these laws and be very negative and teach it. They take the wrong lesson from the spirituality and then try to impose it on society. And I just find that just so crazy and so wrong. It's done so much damage.
Yes, I agree. And the reason would be, to use, Richard Rohr's terminology, is that it's the male ego that took over. Even when you have a spiritual experience, unless you're really empty and unless you're really open and really deep and mature, the old ego's going to come back and appropriate it, for its own ends, power and control and the whole business, especially men, as you said, because that's kind of the way the male ego works, and that's what has to be mortified. As I was just saying, that is what needs to be mortified, not the shadow self that they're trying to hide now and trying to protect the rest of the world from. That's the mistake. Because God doesn't work that way. God works as you experience in prayer, as you see ultimately in the scriptures, and as I said earlier about the way God works in the world so invisibly and so sweetly, as the scriptures said. God works by luring us and speaking to our heart, gradually. He waves hands and all this stuff to get our attention, but ultimately it's a love affair. It's only when you literally fall in love with God that you're really transformed. Not when you become religious or a spiritual or a religious leader who therefore is now going to spread this message to the end of the earth, no matter whose goal you rob or how many people you kill, as long as you're doing it in God's name, and you're not, of course. You think you are. Partly because you don't understand the opacity of the scriptures themselves. The God of the Hebrew scriptures is not the last word. At least when we see the book of Joshua. Okay, anyone? Thank you. Anyone else?
I've noticed that most spiritual people, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, and that's one of the things that makes sexuality so at least equally powerful to the spiritual side of a human being. And that's one of the reasons why many spiritual people repress sexuality, because it's a major, what they used to call distraction to, rise into this, as you said, Platonic view of what you're supposed to be, pure mind, pure soul. But you were saying about, I was just there are some people on the frontiers of neuroscience with respect to why we see things in a dual sense, and not totally confirmed, but the idea is that human beings were watching the sky. You know, the fact that the Earth revolves, you have 12 hours of light, 12 hours of dark. As people had nothing to do, they didn't have cable back then. Okay? So they were watching the sky and all that kind of stuff. So there's almost a natural inclination to do light and dark, good and evil, man and woman. There's something in that Morse ego thing.
You're facing a tiger, you've got to do something. You know. So Richard Rohr is good on this point too. You know, the ego is not bad.
No.
I mean, we need the ego for functioning in the world in these ways that we're speaking about. It's normal to have that. The trouble is when the ego sets up shop and says, I'm in charge. And I'm the whole game, and I'm the only game in town. And I'm the one that's going to manage all this. That's why you have to get beyond that. It's okay, but it's only a $5 bill and you can't buy $100 worth of God's love, you know, with that. You know. And you don't pay for it anyway, so the ego is what always wants to earn and pay for things, which is another error. One of the biggest in spiritual life, not the biggest, I have to earn God's love. You can't, you don't have to. It's the whole message of St. Paul, the whole message of God's, which he's talking about. One of those other things. So, and the other thing he pointed out about the flesh is weak. That's not the body. When St. Paul, when Jesus speaks about the flesh, he means this separate ego self, which is full of fears and anxieties and all this stuff, which is weak, yeah. But it's not the body as such, it's the whole composite, our whole self, including our mind, our psychological mind. That's what's weak. What's not is God's image in us, God's light in us, our true self in God. That's the spirit, of course. The spirit is willing. So that's not the mind. The mind is willing, but the body is weak. When St. Paul speaks about flesh and spirit, it's the same thing. It's the ego self versus the non-separate self, the true self. Really important point, again, Richard makes very well. And that's so important to realize. So, you know, and here, as I said, the people have this wonderful talent for, you know, just the physicality of life is so wonderful, and that's a great contribution, actually. So, I don't care what some people say. I think the gay pride parade is wonderful. All these people dancing around, you know, with not many clothes on. David did the same thing in front of the ark. So, I mean, this is just beautiful. If you just get all the other stuff out of your head and out of your, you know, it's a real testimony to beauty and to life. Seeing it in that sense. Anyone else? So I'd like to do we did Appendix 4, I'd like to do a little 15-minute exercise also from Appendix 5, which is a little more centered on experience of God's presence within us. We just saw the presence of anything, being open to that. Now this is about centering more on our own being. And maybe, if we're lucky, experiencing who we really are in God. He says in the appendix here that this exercise is based on a teaching from a Franciscan, Francisco de Osuna, in the 16th century. I never read that in its original source. He was a teacher of Teresa of Avila, Teresa of Jesus. So this is what he says he taught his students, and then we're going to go through the exercise. And if this works for you, great. And if it doesn't, at least you have a sense of kind of the dynamic that can work, that we can realize is possible. He says, this sounds a little funny, right? Dam up the fountain of your soul, and then it will be forced to rise. What is this fountain called? We just read last Sunday. The living water growing up with eternal life. That's what he's referring to. You will remain quiet and at rest within you. Wait for that quiet within. And then he says, you will see the image of God reflected in your own clear waters. Can you make good on that promise? More resplendent than any other thing. And that's true. Your own soul is the greatest mirror of God in all creation. That's all there is to say. Provided the disturbing turmoil of thoughts lies down. So he says the following is only a commentary and aid on that teaching, so you can experience it for yourself. It's really quite similar to what the Hindus discovered in Tantra. We hold down the life force and don't express it so that it can be deepened and refined. We'll talk more about that tricky subject this afternoon. But I think it is also, he says, what Jesus is offering the Samaritan woman when he says to her, the water that I shall give you will turn into a spring inside of you, welling up into limitless eternal life. So, let's try this and see what happens. This is probably something we've never done before. And I'm not familiar with it quite this form either, but let's see what happens. So the same thing as before, as we're sitting there. Now it says, try to stay beneath your thoughts. Not all the fuss on the surface, like a fish at the surface of the sea, all that noise and activity going on. Kind of sink down, as the mystics say, deeper into the ocean where it's darker, where of course there are monsters there, but don't worry about those for the moment. And sink down where it's quieter and darker. So try to stay beneath your thoughts, neither fighting them nor thinking them. But just disregard them, go deeper. Hold yourself at a deeper level. Perhaps in your chest. Chesterton speaks about men without chests. You live in your head, you're out of your body. So hold yourself at a deeper level, perhaps in your chest, your solar plexus, maybe. Or even your breath, if you want. Someplace in your body self. Your body self. It's not separate from you, it's yourself. In your body self somehow. Do not rise to the mind. And listen to this, which only someone who's lived with their emotions knows. Everything you know long term, you know in your body. Your traumas or joys. Everything you know long term, you know in your body. He writes that in italics. So hold yourself in your body self. Somewhere where you feel rooted and comfortable, whether it's your chest or solar plexus, or stomach, or navel, wherever you feel connection. You're in your breath, you can be your breath. Focus on your breath. So resist any desire to repress or express. Just what he calls animal contentment. Bodily existence. Be in your body. Just be there, whatever it feels like. And he suggests, if your mind is quiet enough, he suggests it will feel exactly like nothing or darkness. Just your bodily existence. And he says, stay crouched there, kind of like an animal in a cave. Stay crouched there at the cellular level. You're just vegetating. Stay crouched there at the cellular level without shame. It's beautiful, it's who you are. Without shame and without fear, if you can. So just stay crouched there in the dark. Just being, breathing, blood pulsating. Stay there. another source to begin to flow. It's that source of living water, the Spirit, Christ within you. Another source is capitalized. Another source. The source. So as you're crouched there inside, open, attentive, offering yourself to this experience, to God, does another source perceptibly rise? Flow. And maybe well up. Maybe experience it as light. Joy. Because the water in last week's gospel is the light of this week's gospel. Welling up. This is the super essential life, he says. Let it well up freely, that current of joy. It's coming. If not, just remain open and attentive, crouched. See if the well opens up beyond words, beyond the mind. That light, that joy. He says, from this place, you become seeing. You become the light and the love. The love flows through you from the source. As an energy, not as an idea. It's not an idea, it's an energy. Flowing up. You become that light, that love, that joy. Experience that. Let go. Don't think about it. Just be it. Whatever's happening, just rest there for a few minutes. In openness and gratitude, or whatever. think God. God is never an object of consciousness like any other thing, or any person or event that he quotes know. God is always and forever the subject, the doer, the initiator, prevenient grace, as theology calls it. And if that's true, then you have become the subject. You have become the subject. What you hope to see. Subject and object are one. God in you and through you sees and loves God. You're transformed into Christ, as St. Paul would say. As John of the Cross says, you're in the Trinity and you're indistinguishable from the Trinity. The Spirit reaping up to eternal life. So, I won't say come back from there, because you're always there, whether you're aware of it or not. It's just nice to be aware of it. Before we break for lunch, anyone want to share the experience, or any questions you have about it, or reactions, or we did with the first exercise? Was anybody there crouching the whole time, not feeling anything? At least you were there in your body. And of course you're there with God whether you even know it or not. But that's where it will happen, where it does happen. When we get out of our heads. Then God can feel everything. Yes?
I found myself next to a river with just grass and sand and water.
So imagery comes in, huh?
Oh. Got my mind jerk. Sometimes. Come back.
Yeah.
Be aware.
Yeah. St. Ignatius and others, have prayer where you use imagery as a help, when you imagine the gospel parables or whatever, and that can be a way of praying. But ultimately, ultimately deeper than that is the wordless, imageless concept. Because as we said, God, that's the language of God. The language of God is silence. Beyond all images, because those aren't, as John of the Cross says, are not adequate, apt to receive God. Yes?
That was fun. Well, my imagery, is that right?
Yeah. Well, I was saying, some people use that as a use the imagery of the crutch, we use it as a crutch. And it's not bad. It's just that, we're trying to go beyond that if we can at this particular exercise. Just to something immediate, not mediated by imagery or concept. So,
Both times I fell asleep.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because I've had, when somebody comes to me in my practice and they say they want a sleeping pill, sometimes I say to them, I don't like to use pills, we can avoid it. And I say, have something, a mantra like you repeat.
Yeah.
I say, for me, it's a rosary. I noticed one year for Lent, in my OCD, I was going to do a rosary every night. I never finished it, I always fall asleep.
Right.
But I came to a really important thought with that, I think you mentioned this earlier, that it kind of gets all the noise out that we all have already. And I think that that's not incompatible with a spirituality.
No.
To say, if we have so much going on we can't even sleep, maybe then this kind of like,
Instead of counting sheep, count Hail Marys.
exactly, no, seriously, or like,
Yeah.
the Orthodox having Lord Jesus Christ and like that.
We're going to be doing that this afternoon. So.
Those kind of, and it's in all traditions. So I tell my patients, it doesn't, you can pick a tradition, pick anything. It doesn't have to be religion or whatever. But the point of that is you've got so much going on in your mind, and I always ask, do you have a TV? Yes. Do you have your phone? And you, yes. Okay, well, these are all things that people, they say, well, just give me a pill. But I think that
Right.
speaks to, and I think we can, then that's another way of understanding God is like outside of all this other stuff that we have. And I think that, there was a book of Kings that says the small sign of voice. And I think that if we can understand that mystically, that is all, that's God. That's, I think, for me, the first step would be to sleep.
Yeah, right. That's a good point. I always, and I like to point out that rosary or vocal prayer, or even images and concepts, are what I like to call fighting fire with fire. It's on the same level as your mind and the concepts and the images, bringing in better images and concepts, kind of flush them out. But it's on the same level. Yeah, it's on the same level as mental activity. And that serves its purpose at certain times, like when you're trying to go through. It's just important to follow the challenge of entering into the silence, which can be a little more scary and a little more disorienting and a little more difficult. But I think it's pretty much essential, not only for psychological, but spiritual growth, and to face the kind of challenges in the world today that we talk about, and in our spiritual lives, and to find a global spirituality, and the depths of our own tradition. Yes.
Yeah. This is only to speak for myself, but it may not be for other people. I have the problem that every once in a while I get this glimpse, the sort of glimpse. Whenever I get this feeling like I am the Father or all those wounds that you talked about before, all my imperfections, I just can't go there. I'm not Father. I'm not God in any sense. There's a distance that comes between me. It may not be for other people. They may be more advanced in the spirituality, but as soon as I feel that pull, all I see is all my small, medium, and large imperfections, and now.
Well, that's your conditioning. That's the conditioning you were given. Always imagining that you're inadequate, you don't deserve it, you're always imperfect. Of course, it's not what gets in the way. And the ego, it's kind of the reverse. It is kind of the ego still saying it's still on the merit performance principle, which is against St. Paul, every gospel and everything. That I've got to earn this, that I have to be worthy of it, that I have to get it, I have to be moral, then I can be a mystic. Whereas, as Richard says, it's the other way around. You have mystical spirits, and that's what makes you moral. Because it's so unmerited. Wow, God loves me no matter what, and I'm Christ. I'm the body of Christ. I'm transformed into Him, as St. Paul says. And so I already have it. I already am. And this other stuff gets just washed away and carried up lovingly and reconciled and forgiven and loved by God, and then just disappears in His light love. Cast all our sins into the depths of the sea, as the prophet Micah says. As far as the east is from the west, so far as does he throw our sins from us. So that's just your condition.
But I don't maybe
it's 60 years of condition.
Maybe it is, but I don't love myself in that.
No, clearly not.
Yeah, I don't love myself. Maybe I don't love my imperfections. Maybe that's what I have to work on. But
you have to love what God loves, which is you as you are.
Well, we can't even receive communion without saying, I am not worthy. Okay? That's crazy to me.
Well, of course, it's a scriptural thing, and it's true that, what does it even mean? Of course we're not worthy, but then, so who cares? God clearly doesn't care, whatever that even means. God doesn't speak in terms of worthiness, literally.
No.
Because God loves us when we're His enemies, as St. Paul says. He loves us all the time. God cannot not love us.
And He heals the centurion's son.
Well, of course.
I'm not wherever you come under my roof, but
so He does it
at a distance too, no less.
So if you want, don't think about what you're saying. Just use it as a way of opening your.
I never say that. I never say I am not worthy. I say, even though sometimes I feel that I'm not worthy, you make me ready through your word and heal divine body and soul.
Okay.
So that's what
works for you. It
me.
works for you. I just get out of the whole worthiness game entirely.
I think Francis provided he's provided. I've actually added this to my pre-communion prayer. I say to myself, God, come to me in spite of my unworthiness, because of my unworthiness.
Yes.
And I add what Francis has said. And I ask that you be the powerful nourishment to my weakness. We're all weak. We all need this powerful nourishment, and Francis said that the Eucharist is not a prize for the purpose.
Exactly.
So, and this is the Pope's hand. I think that's, I love
but it's nourishment, you know.
Did you finish
We can-
that?
it's called-
That was good. I didn't hear that.
So I say, you know, God, come to me in spite of my unworthiness, because of my unworthiness, both things I needed, and be the powerful nourishment for me in my weakness. And that's what Francis has said, because he says there's, you know, the whole controversy, especially in this country, of bishops, of priests saying you can't have communion. And Francis specifically said that's very wrong. And he says that the Eucharist is not a prize for the perfect, but it's a powerful nourishment for the weak, and for all of us who are weak.
The weak and the hungry. More than that, even St. Paul says it's when I'm weak that I'm strong, because that's when I'm most.
Well, that's that right there. That's the central part.
Well, of course, yes. The weakness of God, which is stronger than human strength, and which the weakness, our weakness allows, is as our way of opening to the strength of God. Otherwise, we're depending on our silly little ego strength, and which keeps the spirit out. The spirit can't get in there when our cup is already full. So that's
the problem with, I think, some people in a hierarchy or in power of any sort. I always say, when somebody is making pronouncements, I say, do you say the Lord's Prayer every day? You should. They probably do. We'll say, you know, give me this day my daily bread, just today, not tomorrow, just today, and forgive me.
Yeah.
You know, if you're not getting on your knees every day and saying, and this includes the Pope and everybody in between.
we just went to confession.
Exactly, yeah. But all folks of God can, but being in a public show, which I think is important. But I think I've always said, like in 2006, the church came out with a document saying that men with deep-seated homosexual tendencies. I mean, I remember the quote, but like, you know, this was they find themselves in a situation. They find themselves in a situation in which they can incorrectly relate with men and with women, and therefore the negative possibilities of ordaining them can't relate to people. Cannot relate to men or to women appropriately, and then the negative consequences of their being ordained cannot be overlooked. So, I mean, honestly, that was the one thing almost left the church.
Yeah,
but I think that you know, this Pope and is worth bringing up. I've always said that that's blasphemy, because that's implying that God is unable to do something. God cannot call one person to the priesthood. This includes women, but that's another reason. That God cannot call this person to the priesthood. And if somebody says, well, these people are psychologically, you know, broken or something, they can't do it, and I say, well, you can't, nobody can, the Pope can. Yeah. If you are not on your knees every day asking for God's help, then you shouldn't be a priest or a pope or whatever. You need to understand your own weakness and your own need for nourishment, and our universal, in a sense, unworthiness, because none of us is perfect. Before you can even hope to be a priest or a believer in that regard. Yeah, that was a pretty horrible document.
It was tough.
But luckily no one pays any attention.
Yeah.
Well, least of all the Italians.
But that brings up another point. You talked about the male ego, and so much of the anti-gay legislation in the churches, it's like the open secret view. There's a lot of gay men in high positions and throughout history.
That's where the hypocrisy comes in.
Exactly. But it's
we're talking about integrity and honesty. Well, yes, of course. It's internalized homophobia. That's why I say it's still tragic to today to see so many people, young men, young closeted gay men, still going through the motions, you know, priesthood or married life, and not facing the truth about themselves. You can't. How can you help bring others to their truth if you haven't come to your own?
Absolutely.
You can't be a leader, a spiritual leader, if you haven't reached your own truth. It's terrible. So the stakes are high here. Not only for yourself, but for the world. We'll talk more about that too.
I had a priest when I was thinking about priesthood many times. He told me, I thought it was really cryptic at first, but it makes a lot of sense over the years. He says, you can't be a priest until you kind of heart.
Yeah, that's true too. Well, that's part of the craft.
But now it's making more sense as years go on.
Right. You're going to have your heart broken anyway, but you certainly can't minister. You can't be an authentic human being and not recognize your wounds and have your heart broken. And help others who are, as the Psalms always say, you heal the brokenhearted. How can you be the vehicle of God healing the brokenhearted if you don't even know what that means? Have no sympathy for it, no compassion for it, you can't recognize it. So I think gay people have a head start on that one too, right? All right, well let's break for lunch. We'll take an hour and a half so you have time to talk. So 1:30 or 1.